Hi, welcome to US History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering chapter 8, and before we get into it, I gotta say that the structure of this chapter is really confusing to me. You see, it's called Varieties of American Nationalism, but then it never really gives a clear definition of what nationalism is or what the specific varieties that it's talking about are. So right off the bat, I want to fix those two things. First off, for purposes of this chapter, nationalism is basically anything that shifts focus, power, or authority away from the states, the different regions of the country, or even foreign countries, and toward the United States as a single nation. I should also note real quick that in the context of modern politics, nationalism means something totally different, but we're going to talk about that later. For now, we're going to use this definition because I think that's how the textbook is using it in this chapter. So then the question is, what are the different varieties of nationalism that we're going to look at? Broadly, I think there are three categories: politics, economics, and expansionism. Those three categories are going to overlap and feed into each other throughout this episode, but I think it's worth laying them out at the start so that we have a general framework to work off of. And with that, let's get into it, starting with the politics. So last time we talked about how the Federalist Party kind of collapsed at the end of the War of 1812. Historians call the decade following this collapse the Era of Good Feelings, because it marked an end, or at least a pause, to the bitter partisan conflicts that had characterized the relationship between Federalists and Democratic Republicans in the previous decades. The most immediate consequence of this was that the presidential elections of 1816 and 1820 were super lopsided, and the Republican candidate James Monroe won without much competition. Interestingly, Monroe didn't really view this as a total ideological victory for his party. He saw it as an opportunity for the party to expand and try to truly represent all of America, rather than just representing the dominant interests and ideologies of the South and the West. That's why, when he was choosing advisors for his cabinet, he made a point of picking people from different regions, and in some cases, even picking former Federalists. Now, the most important position that Monroe had to fill was the Secretary of State. You see, the last three presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, had all served as Secretary of State prior to being elected president. People noticed this pattern, and they started to view the Secretary of State as essentially the next man in line to be president. Monroe gave the position to John Quincy Adams, who was a capable diplomat, a former Federalist, and the son of former President John Adams. This contributed to the process of expanding the Republican Party to incorporate the whole country, but it also did something else. You see, of the first 8 presidential elections, 7 had been won by Virginians. This dominance of the presidency was called the Virginia Dynasty, and it was actually one of the specific things that Federalists were complaining about at the Hartford Convention last chapter. Since Adams was from Massachusetts, picking him as Secretary of State was a signal that Monroe was planning to end the Virginia Dynasty after his presidency. Now, while all of that was going on, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, was doing exactly what they were doing last chapter: expanding the power of the federal government. Your textbook lists a bunch of different cases from this era, but there are 3 that I think are worth mentioning specifically. Fletcher v. Peck gave the Supreme Court the right to strike down state laws that violated the U.S. Constitution. Previously, they had only used this power for federal laws. McCulloch v. Maryland said that the state governments weren't allowed to pass laws that tried to interfere with or overrule federal law. And finally, Cohens v. Virginia gave the Supreme Court the right to hear complaints in criminal cases where the states had allegedly violated the defendant's constitutional rights. Taken together, these 3 decisions continued the process of giving the national government power over the state governments in both the legislature and the court system. With that, let's turn our attention to the economy. And here, I think the textbook does something confusing again, because it talks about the, quote, emerging capitalist system, but it doesn't really give a clear explanation of what capitalism is or how it works. I'm going to try and fill that gap, and don't worry, we're not going to get super technical here. Instead, I actually think the best way to explain capitalism is with a comparison to the system that existed in Europe before capitalism, which is called feudalism. To keep things simple, we're going to specifically talk about how these two systems handled land, and we're going to try to answer 3 specific questions. Who owns the land? Who gets to use the land? And how does the land change hands? First of all, under feudalism, in general, all of the land was technically owned by the king. Rather than using all of the land himself, the king would basically give permission to various lords to manage parts of the land on his behalf. Those lords would then turn around and parcel out some of their land to the peasant families who lived there, they'd keep some of it for themselves, and they'd block some of it off as common pasture area. This created a hierarchical structure where everyone was basically using the land with the permission of the person above them in the hierarchy. The last question is how the land changed hands, and generally in feudalism, the land really only changed hands through marriages and inheritances. If your father farmed this land, then you inherited the right to farm that land too. If your father was lord over a certain area, you inherited that title and the right to administer that land as well. And I hear you saying, what is this, the history of Westeros? Get back to the United States. But I want to point out that economic systems like this don't disappear overnight. Some aspects of feudalism actually lasted long enough to make their way into the early English colonies in America. For example, you may remember that many towns in early New England included commons like the common pasture areas on medieval European manors. And if you think about it, the headright system that was used to distribute land in the early days of Virginia has some similarities to that feudal hierarchy that I was just talking about. The king granted the Virginia Company permission to settle Virginia, then the Virginia Company granted land to anyone who paid to travel there, and they granted extra land to anyone who paid for more people to come over, which meant that richer people, who were often direct descendants of those feudal lords that we were just talking about, got more land in Virginia, which they could then parcel out and have indentured servants work on their behalf. The difference is that the Virginia Company wasn't just giving people permission to use the land, they were giving out actual ownership. And that brings us to capitalism. You see, in a capitalist system, the land is basically owned by individuals or by companies, which are in turn owned by individuals. Whoever owns the land has the right to use it themselves, or give someone else temporary permission to use it, or they can just sell it. And that's basically how land changes hands in a capitalist system. People can just buy and sell it whenever they want. And the thing about capitalism is that those same rules I just laid out for land apply to basically any other commodity too. And that leads us to one final insight for this section. You see, in a feudal society, if you wanted to get rich, you kind of had to either have rich parents or marry someone who had rich parents. Under capitalism, you can totally still do those things, but there's also a third path. You can make things, sell them, and then take the money and buy more of the stuff you need to make things, whether that's land or raw materials or whatever. Then you repeat the cycle over and over again, hopefully gaining some amount of profit each time until you have so much money that you can do crazy stuff like going to space or producing a Lord of the Rings prequel or even buying Twitter and running it into the ground. The world is your oyster. This cycle provides us with a useful framework to talk about some of the economic developments that were happening in the United States during the early 1800s. The first step, make things, saw innovations in the form of the growing textile industry in New England. The textbook tells us that the textile industry grew about 16 times larger in the 8 years from 1807 to 1815. And the industry wasn't just getting bigger, it was also developing new technology. In 1815, Francis Cabot Lowell and his company patented a new power loom, which for the first time allowed a single factory to do all of the processing needed to transform raw cotton into finished cloth. The second step in the capitalist cycle is sell things. Now last time I talked about how steamboats and privately funded toll roads made it easier for people to physically get their goods to market so that they could sell them. Over time, however, it became obvious that private companies weren't going to be willing to build out all of the infrastructure that the nation needed. This led to a series of political disputes over who was actually going to pay. Many people wanted the federal government to finance projects like roads, bridges, and canals, and Congress actually passed a bill to fund these so-called internal improvements at the end of James Madison's term as president. Madison supported the idea behind the bill, but he actually believed that Congress didn't have the authority to implement it without a constitutional amendment, so he vetoed it. For the time being, internal improvements would have to be funded by private companies or the states. However, this issue will come up again at the national level before the end of this episode. Now, the third stage of the capitalist cycle for northern textile mills is where we really get to see the national aspect of the economy in this period. You see, one of the main raw materials that northern industry was buying was southern cotton. That meant that the same transactions that made up stage 3 for northerners were also stage 2 for southerners. One side was buying the cotton and the other side was selling it. And so yeah, the economic activities were still very different in different regions of the country, but now they were becoming increasingly interconnected and drawing more and more people into a fully fledged national economy. Looking quickly at the southern capitalist cycle, Stage 1 was growing and harvesting cotton. Stage 2 was selling it to northern or in many cases European factories. And stage 3 was where planters scaled up their operations by buying more land and by buying more enslaved people to work on that land. We'll talk about all of that in more detail in a later chapter, but it is important to note while we're talking about the emerging capitalist system that your textbook describes, that system still included buying and selling human beings and forcing them to work for their entire lives for no wages. Before we move on from the economics section, there's one last topic we need to cover. In 1811, the charter for the Bank of the United States came up for renewal. Now, Republicans had hated the bank ever since Alexander Hamilton proposed it 2 chapters ago, so they just let it expire. However, by the end of the War of 1812, they changed their minds and decided that the government did need some kind of centralized authority to manage the nation's finances. So, in 1816, Congress chartered the creatively named Second Bank of the United States to get things under control. The problem was that a ton of money in the American finance system was tied up in land speculation, which I've described in earlier episodes as gambling, but actually, the capitalist cycle that we've been talking about gives us another way to think about it. You see, where capitalism normally follows the steps buy things, make things, sell things, speculation follows the steps buy things, kind of just hope that the price goes up, and then sell those same things later for a profit. In the case of land on the western frontier, this seemed like a pretty safe bet. As long as people were moving west, and as long as southern capitalists kept expanding their cotton plantations, there would always be enough demand to drive the price up. However, around the same time, Europe's economy was finally returning to normal after the Napoleonic Wars, and Britain was starting to import more of its cotton from India. That meant that American agricultural products suddenly had a lot more competition, which in turn meant that farmers and planters faced lower prices when they went to sell their crops. So, when the Second Bank of the United States started making local banks pay them back in hard currency, those banks didn't have the money because they'd loaned it all to farmers, and the farmers didn't have money because they were making way less profit off of their crops. The banks foreclosed on the farmers and took the land back, but that meant that all of a sudden there was way more land for sale at a time when no one could make any money farming, all of which drove the price of land down and wiped out anyone who had taken out a loan to speculate on land, which remember was basically everyone, including the banks. In the end, many Americans lost their homes and their jobs, many local banks went completely out of business, and large sections of the American finance system essentially collapsed. This so-called Panic of 1819 was worst in the West, and while everything I just described may sound complicated to you and me, to them it was very simple. The Second Bank of the United States had ruined their lives by overstepping its authority. From there, let's move on to expansionism. I didn't mention this last chapter, but one interesting thing about the Louisiana Purchase was that at the time the agreement was signed, Americans didn't really know exactly what they were buying. In 1803, Jefferson commissioned an expedition led by Lewis and Clark to explore the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. They were accompanied by a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who spoke some of the local indigenous languages and served as an interpreter. The expedition made it all the way to the Pacific and returned in 1806 with maps and detailed notes about the region. Around the same time, Jefferson sent another explorer named Zebulon Pike to map the southern part of the Louisiana Purchase. During this period, most of the Louisiana Purchase remained pretty sparsely populated. There were a lot of different Native American groups there, but for the most part, the only white Americans in the region were explorers like the guys I just mentioned, or fur traders. But actually, the Louisiana Purchase was kind of old news at this point. The real hot new target for American expansionism was Florida. You see, Andrew Jackson was in charge of the army in the South, which meant that part of his job was protecting the border between the US and Spanish Florida. However, as Jackson saw it, Spanish rule of Florida would always be a threat to the stability of the region for the following 3 reasons. First of all, Spain was totally incapable of preventing the native Seminoles from raiding American settlements near the border. Secondly, if Spain ever did get their act together enough to control the Seminoles, they could just supply them with weapons and send them against the United States on purpose. Finally, Spanish Florida had been a thorn in the side of Southern planters for decades because it provided a refuge for African Americans who escaped from slavery. You may remember the Stono Rebellion back in 1739, which was a slave revolt that had the specific goal of crossing the border into Spanish Florida and finding freedom there. Jackson believed that the only long-term solution to this problem was to conquer Florida and bring it under direct American control. He took matters into his own hands in what came to be called the First Seminole War. In 1816 and again in 1818, Jackson's troops crossed the border into Spanish Florida and launched attacks on anyone that he saw as a threat to the United States. The second invasion culminated with Jackson taking the Spanish city of Pensacola. Now, this was slightly awkward for the Monroe administration because the United States wasn't technically at war with Spain, so we weren't really supposed to be, invading Florida and stuff. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams took advantage of the situation by using the threat that the United States could just take all of Florida if it wanted to help negotiate an agreement called the Adams-Onís Treaty in 1819. The treaty basically said that the United States would get Florida, Spain would give up its claims to land in the Pacific Northwest, and the United States would give up its claims to land in Texas, which some people argued was included in the Louisiana Purchase. Zooming out for a second, the Adams-Onís Treaty was part of a larger shift in the United States' relationship with the Spanish-speaking parts of the Americas during this period. Latin America was going through several decades of revolutions, and while the United States largely remained neutral in those revolutions, once they succeeded, the US recognized the independent nations as legitimate governments, rather than just rebels against Spanish authority. Americans also quickly opened trade with these nations, most importantly with Mexico. All of this eventually led to the Monroe Doctrine, a statement of American foreign policy that said the US would oppose any further attempts by European powers to colonize the Americas. Now, could the United States realistically stop the great powers of Europe if they wanted to reconquer South America? Probably not at this point. But in practice, the British Navy actually enforced this doctrine because Britain's colonial interests were shifting towards Asia, and they just didn't want to have to waste time and money fighting in the Americas anymore. The thing that actually matters about the Monroe Doctrine is just the fact that the United States was really starting to see itself as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere at this point. Finally, we have to talk about the biggest issue that came up around American expansion during this time, the Missouri Compromise. In this section, we're going to hear a lot about slave states and free states, so we should take just a second to explain the difference between those two things. Slave states were states in which slavery was legal, and you may think that means that free states are states in which slavery was totally illegal, but that's not exactly true. You see, free states are states that had begun the process of ending slavery, usually through something called gradual emancipation, which is a fancy way of saying that they freed enslaved people slowly over the course of several decades. In fact, by 1820, only 4 of the 11 free states had actually freed their entire population, and New York in particular still held over 10,000 people in bondage. Now, why do I bring that up? Am I saying that slave states and free states were really morally equivalent because neither group had totally ended slavery? No, absolutely not. Virginia, by itself, enslaved more than 20 times as many people as all of the free states put together, and South Carolina was still enslaving well over half of its population at this point. The slave states were worse. My point is 2 things. First, I want to note that when you're talking about massive social reforms like ending slavery, just passing the law isn't the end of the story. There's a bunch of work that has to happen on the ground to actually carry out that change. For example, many free black communities spent this period saving up and pooling their money to buy friends and family out of slavery and speed up that gradual process that the law outlined. On top of that, anti-slavery advocates, both black and white, spent a lot of time and resources suing enslavers who were trying to keep people in bondage after they were supposed to be freed. Even after the Emancipation Law was passed, people had to actively work to make sure that it was actually being enforced. My second point is that in 1820, even the free states weren't uniformly anti-slavery. Their main concern at this point was really just preventing slavery from expanding westward into the territories. Still though, slave state politicians saw any level of anti-slavery sentiment as a threat, especially because the population was increasing faster in the free states than it was in the slave states, which meant that the slave states would be facing an increasingly sharp disadvantage in the House of Representatives over time. The one saving grace for pro-slavery legislators was the fact that every state gets 2 senators, and there were currently equal numbers of slave states and free states. That meant that the Senate was evenly split, and it also meant that the balance of power would be broken if a new state was admitted to the Union on either side of the slavery question. In 1819, Missouri applied for statehood, presumably as a slave state, but anti-slavery forces in Congress pushed for a deal that would essentially force them to join as a free state instead. Senators from the slaveholding South rejected the deal, and the debate became increasingly contentious as it stretched out into 1820. However, around the same time, Maine also applied to be its own state. Speaker of the House Henry Clay did some procedural witchcraft and eventually put together the following compromise. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine as a free state, thus preserving the balance of power in the Senate. At the same time, slavery was prohibited in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, north of the 3630 line, which is essentially the southern border of Missouri. This compromise solved the immediate issues of Missouri and Maine statehood, but it also marked the beginning of nearly half a century of escalating tensions about slavery, and in particular, its relationship to westward expansion. To quote former President Thomas Jefferson, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror." Jefferson continued ominously, saying that the Missouri Compromise was a reprieve only, not a final sentence. He believed that the division between the free North and the slave South would only grow deeper over time, potentially eventually leading to the end of the Union. In this letter, Jefferson also made an interesting claim that no one was more committed to ending slavery than he was. He just couldn't find a practical solution that would end the institution without risking the safety and stability of Southern society. Quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." I wanted to highlight this as an example of the self-defense argument for slavery that I talked about last time. This allowed Southerners to sort of have their cake and eat it too by claiming to oppose slavery on moral grounds while still personally benefiting from it and realistically doing nothing to stop it. With that, we can move on from expansionism and cover a few more politics things to close out the chapter. At the end of Monroe's second term, the era of good feelings basically immediately went up in flames. The presidential election of 1824 saw 4 different candidates running for president, 3 of whom actually matter. The first was Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House who had brokered the Missouri Compromise. Clay campaigned on an economic platform called the American System, which promised protective tariffs for American industry, federal support for internal improvements like roads and bridges, and a strong central bank to guide the nation's finance system. The next candidate was John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State who had engineered most of the country's foreign policy under Monroe. His platform was similar to Henry Clay's. Finally, you had Andrew Jackson, the general who had won a string of victories in the Creek War, the Battle of New Orleans, and the First Seminole War, making him incredibly popular in the Southwest. Jackson's position was basically the opposite of Adams and Clay's. He believed that the federal government, particularly in the form of the Second Bank of the United States, had grown too powerful. They were manipulating the economy to suit the interests of the entrenched aristocracy in the East and ignoring the good of what he saw as regular Americans. Voters were split, and although Andrew Jackson got more votes than anyone else, both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College, he failed to reach a majority. That meant that the decision fell to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay was out of the running at this point, but he threw his support behind Adams, which gave Adams just enough votes to win the presidency. Now, from the perspective of Jackson's supporters, what just happened was that there was an election, and Jackson got the most votes. And then it went to the Electoral College, and Jackson got the most votes. And then Henry Clay and John Adams went into a back room and made a secret deal to ignore the will of the American people, and then Adams just got to be president. This theory was only strengthened when Adams named Clay as his Secretary of State and assumed successor. Jackson's supporters took to calling this whole affair the corrupt bargain because, well, it's not corrupt. I mean, it's definitely legal, and that is how the US electoral system works, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes a ton of sense. I mean, maybe we should have, passed a constitutional amendment to make presidential elections make sense at some point, but we all kind of just got distracted and forgot about it. By the time Adams took office, the Democratic-Republican Party had split into 2 factions. The Jacksonian faction favored decentralizing the economy and would eventually become the Democratic Party. The anti-Jacksonian faction, led by men like Adams and Clay, broadly favored centralizing the economy and would eventually become the National Republican Party. The Jacksonians made it their mission to prevent Adams from accomplishing anything for the next 4 years, and for the most part, they were pretty successful. Adams' only policy win was a new tariff in 1828, but by the time it got to his desk, the law was so expansive that nobody really got what they wanted out of it. Southerners, whose economy was dependent on European imports, were so outraged by the increased prices they faced that they took to calling this law the Tariff of Abominations. When Adams came up for re-election in 1828, Jackson ran against him, and this time, Jackson won decisively. He would go on to be one of the most consequential and most divisive presidents of the age, but that will have to wait for Chapter 9. For now, let's move on to the last part of this video and talk about why this matters to us in the 21st century. The Missouri Compromise may seem like ancient history. You know, the sort of thing that you memorize as part of a list of stuff that led to the Civil War and then forget the instant you finish taking the test. But here's the thing. There are currently, like literally right now, debates happening about admitting two different places as potential 51st or 52nd states. But just like we saw with Missouri, adding these new states could mess with the balance of power in the Senate, which at the time I'm writing this is once again split 50-50. So, let's take a quick look at these two potential new states. The first one is Washington, D.C. D.C. actually has more people than Wyoming or Vermont, but right now they have no voting representation whatsoever in the House or the Senate. Which is kind of a problem because Article 1 of the Constitution actually gives Congress the right to do basically whatever they want in the district. Given that situation, it seems pretty understandable that most of the 700,000-ish Americans who live there want to become a state and have the right to participate in their own government just like the other 50 states do. And the House actually recently passed a bill to grant DC statehood. It just has no chance of passing the Senate because people think DC would elect senators from a certain party and throw the balance of power in their favor. In fact, I'll link to a video from a House hearing on the topic in which one representative referred to DC statehood as, quote, a power grab. He went on to directly ask the mayor of DC whether or not there was a plan to admit another state at the same time that would vote for his party to keep things balanced. It's exactly the same logic that we saw in 1820. And similar things are true for Puerto Rico, which is home to another 3.25 million Americans who have no voting representation in Congress. However, like with DC, there's an assumption that Puerto Rico would elect senators from a particular party, and that threatens the balance of power in the Senate, so the other party won't ever agree to it. In an interview in 2019, the Senate Majority Leader described DC and Puerto Rico statehood as nothing more than an attempt to add senators for the other party. His statement ended with, quote, and yeah, as long as I'm the majority leader of the Senate, none of that stuff is going anywhere. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't mentioned which party people think DC and Puerto Rico would vote for. If you don't know already, you can look it up fairly easily, but before you do, you should take a second to think about how you feel about statehood right now. And then you should ask yourself if that would change if they elected senators from the party that you don't like. And then finally, you should ask yourself whether or not it's really fair to tell almost 4 million Americans that they aren't allowed to have a voice in their national legislature because you think they might vote the wrong way. And look, there's more to these issues than I'm letting on. Washington, D.C. has a few special concerns around the Constitution, and there's a whole complicated history between the United States and Puerto Rico that we won't get into in this series for another 80 years or so. My point is just that admitting a new state to the Union has been a controversial process for 2 centuries at this point, and it's still going on largely because of a quirk in how the Senate works. If representation there was based on population like it is in the House, neither DC nor Puerto Rico would make that big of a difference, and people might be more open to letting them be states. As it is, it's hard to see how these issues could get resolved anytime soon. At some level, we're fighting against exactly the same political gridlock that we were in 1819. So yeah, that's it for this episode. Sorry to end on such a downer, but that's the way it is sometimes. Thanks for watching. If you found it helpful or informative, go ahead and like the video, leave a comment, subscribe for future episodes. Otherwise, we'll see you next time for Chapter 9, Jacksonian America, in which Andrew Jackson spends 8 straight years improving life for the common man. Terms and conditions apply.